As became quite evident this week, this country and most of the world has a massively flawed system for determining the compensation for the actual work that somebody does. We just allowed one individual to have the wealth of 5 million times that of the median worker in the US. So if Elon has say $1 trillion in wealth, the median worker, at the average, but the median worker in the US has about $200,000 on average in wealth. Then that makes him 5 million times more wealthy than the median worker. And I'm going to start with this and then elaborate on it and probably say it many more times throughout this project. No individual works 5 million times harder than the average or the median worker in this country. No one individual is 5 million times smarter. No one is 5 million times more educated, 5 million times more innovative. They do not make 5 million times more decisions. They're not 5 million times more laborious. They're not 5 million times more stressed out at their job. No one individual is millions of times more anything than the average worker. No individual is even thousands of times more any of these things. They aren't even hundreds of times more any of these things than the median worker. And let me just demonstrate just with a small example of what I'm talking about. So if you took, say, one contractor, say a drywaller, and said, we will pay you twice as much if you work twice as hard. So imagine what that would actually entail. So say the average drywaller can put up, say like 10 sheets of drywall in an hour. No idea if that's true. Just totally spitballing. Then tell them, okay, now with as hard as you already work, we're going to pay you twice as much if you put up 20 sheets in an hour. That person would have to work themselves to death, right, to do that. So, I don't know, maybe they could. And say maybe they could put up 20 sheets an hour. So then, yes, they would be worth twice as much as what the average drywaller would be. Now let's say that we'll pay them 3 times as much. Say we'll pay them 4 times as much. Say we'll pay them 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times as much. It is absolutely humanly impossible for anybody to do this. The thing is, you can apply this logic to any profession, to computer programmers, to doctors, to people in sales. It doesn't matter. The amount of actual work a worker can do compared to the average is very limited. But this logic also applies to CEOs. So say the average CEO's net worth in the US is about $10 million, which is really high. If you look at the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, they say that the average CEO pay across all industries is about $200,000 a year. Though if you're in the S&P 500, it's about 20 million. But anyways, do you know how hardworking, how smart, how motivated that most CEOs are, regardless of what industry they're in? They work their freaking butts off. Elon does nothing more to make him 100,000 times more wealthy than the average CEO in this country. He is not 100,000 times more innovative. He's not 100,000 times more stressed, smarter, and on and on. It's ludicrous to suggest that any one CEO could be worth 100,000 times the average CEO in this country. And I get it. Like the wealth of the super rich, it doesn't just come from wages, right? It comes from bonuses, comes from other things. It especially comes from stocks. But the same principle holds. If your compensation is based on the growth in stock of your business, and that compensation should be limited to the work that you actually do, particularly how that work compares to the average worker. Are you really millions, thousands, hundreds of times anything the average worker? So why is this possible? Why do we allow people to be worth so much. In part, it's because our system for determining a worker's compensation isn't based on the work that they actually do. It's based on whatever the market determines is the value of their work. The market, right? What an absolutely flawed system for determining the compensation for the work that an individual actually does. The market, all right. So this is how it works. Imagine you have one worker that can manufacture, produce, say, one bottle of water and sell it to an individual who is, say they're well hydrated, right? Um, they don't really want to pay much for it. Say they're in the state of Michigan, the Great Lakes state, lakes everywhere. So let's say that consumer will pay like $2 for that bottle of water. Okay. That same worker who does the same amount of work to produce a bottle of water can instead sell that bottle of water to a person, say, dying of thirst in the middle of the desert for $10, $20, $50 because that consumer is so desperate for it. The work one does to make that bottle of water is no different. But because the willingness of what one will pay is different, that worker will get compensated totally different. The market is where you can have one, say, good-looking individual, a model, a supermodel, who can show off their good looks and make millions of dollars, whereas a teacher who works their butt off to educate our children is getting compensated a tiny fraction of that model. You can have a financial manager who can make millions of dollars doing nothing but moving money around, buying low, selling high, just extracting wealth from society and the economy. But a construction worker can work their butt off building a house for a family to live in and make nothing in comparison. The list of examples is obviously endless with contradictions with how people are compensated for the work that they actually do. And with Elon, we have a market now that has decided to compensate one individual trillions of dollars for the work that he did. So this is a complete market failure. The other flaw with the market is this. The market allows for a theoretically unlimited number of transactions or an unlimited number of consumers for a good or a service, right? A person can spend a year writing a book, for example, and have a potentially unlimited number of buyers. But another person who can spend a year growing corn can have only a limited number of buyers for that corn. A doctor can treat only so many people. A plumber can plumb only so many homes. But a social media company has a potentially unlimited number of consumers for their product. The workers at that company do no more work than the average relative worker of any other industry. But because they're in an industry with an unlimited consumer base, they can roll. The revenue potential is through the roof compared to industries that don't have an unlimited number of consumers. And I'm not going to get too academic. These types of industries with an unlimited consumer base, they're sometimes referred to as scalable industries, right? Where the rate of revenue growth is greater than the rate of resources actually needed to produce a good or service. I'm not going to get too technical here. I'll save it for another video. The other issue with compensating workers based on the potential consumer base for an industry is some industries just don't have buyers. Teachers, workers in the public service, academic researchers, there are numerous jobs like this. My point is, the compensation for the work that one does shouldn't be based on the industry that they work in or the number of potential buyers for a product. It should be based on the work that a person actually does. And it didn't always used to be like this. There didn't used to be a market for goods and services, right? I like to think of this in terms of what I call tribal economics, where you were rewarded equivalently based on what you actually produced. So when there didn't used to be a market for goods and services, and I'll dig more into this in another video, but the system of having a potentially unlimited market for what one produces is a pretty new phenomenon in the history of humanity, right? It absolutely did not used to be like this for most of the history of humanity. But now we have all this new technology and all these innovations that allow for this mass productivity of our workforce with an unlimited market potential. And now that we're in this system of determining compensation based on the market, it's become so accepted that this is just natural in the way it has to be when actually it doesn't. There are alternatives. And actually, the field of human resources um, actually uses a pretty good system for determining compensation for the average worker, but not for C-suite executives. And I'll get into that in another vid. Sorry for I keep saying that. Anyways, one other thing, we're so obsessed with the metric productivity for determining compensation. Productivity. Productivity is a very flawed metric for determining compensation across occupations. And there's no consistent way of measuring it. And this is key across occupations. You can measure productivity differences within occupations, absolutely, but not across. And if you can't measure productivity consistently across occupations, you can't logically say it's the primary measure that we should be using for determining the compensation for the work that somebody does in an economy. If there's no consistent logic, if there's no consistency in the logic, then it's not logic, it's just BS. And we're fed this, unfortunately, by every capitalist economist, all the wealthy elites, and unfortunately, all the politicians who are bought off by the wealthy elites. You know, and I haven't even gotten into, the absolute lack of consideration for people who come from different backgrounds, different income levels, different locations, that they live and how adjustments should be made for how these people are compensated, you know, and also just as importantly, how about the idea of luck and how it is that so many people are wealthy just because of straight up luck, just being in the right place at the right time. So what is my point of all this? This is why you tax the hell out of the super rich. We have a massively flawed system for determining the worth or compensation of a worker, and I don't think you'll ever change our culturally entrenched thinking that the market is the best method for this, you know, but you can at least rein in the extreme excess in wealth that the system allows for. With the wealth of Elon now and having so many billionaires, and so many centimillionaires, we have definitive proof that our current economic system has totally failed. None of these people should be compensated what they do based on the work that they actually do. We need economic justice, and that's what this project is about.